Around the same time that I was watching a grotesque battle between some ill-made thing conjured by one of my students and a wily domestic cat, my friend and church sacristan Claudette was engaged in a battle of her own, with herself and her own resolve. Since she had seen the creature, a werewolf or dogman, a few weeks earlier, Claudette had been convinced that demons were stalking the town of Morton, and particularly the area around the church. She had taken to wearing literally scores of rosary bead sets around her neck, wrapped tight around her forearms, dangling from her pockets everywhere. Each hour that she was awake, she rubbed her entire face with holy water, and she had resolved after a conversation with me not to leave the church or the sacristy after dark, for fear of what might be waiting for her in the shadows. The priest, however, had made no such resolution. Despite Claudette's odd behaviour, her confessions to him of her sightings, and her absolute conviction that there were monsters hunting people in Morton, Father Michael remained unconvinced. Though belief in such things was accepted, if not actually required in his faith, that did not mean he had to accept every cock and bull story he heard about devils and bogeymen. And being a priest in Morton, he had heard more than a few. As an outsider who had been moved to this parish a few years earlier, he had been struck within the first few weeks by how obsessed with the darker side of the supernatural the locals seemed to be. Not a week went by when he didn't have someone in his confessional box or at a consultation spilling their guts with absolute earnest honesty about some encounter they had with bad magic, strange creatures, or the occult. Most of the time he listened carefully to these stories, but he also dismissed them as delusional. He had often mentioned to Claudette that the entire town would make a fantastic field study for psychologists looking into group psychosis, or the idea that mass hysteria could be more than one event and instead be a creeping, insidious suggestion that bleeds into the daily lives of an entire population, shaping their outlook and making them more susceptible to stories about monsters. He, as an outsider, was immune and took great delight in telling Claudette precisely that with increasing frequency. Still, despite her annoyance at these casually offhand dismissals of real concerns, Claudette both cared about and for the priest, and naturally worried a great deal when he left for duties in the evening and did not return until after dark. Looking out from her window onto the grounds of the church, she waited eagerly for his return, and in the process found herself becoming fixated on 2 crisp packets that had become lodged in the thorns of the rose bushes on the way up to the church. Usually she would collect that kind of errant litter during her afternoon rounds, but since she was now retreating into the sacristy as soon as the sun went down, she sometimes missed bits that the later leavers from the school discarded. Kids coming out late after some extracurricular or more likely detention carelessly threw away the wrappers and packaging, leading it to become lodged in places like that and making the grounds look scruffy. The more Claudette stared at that packet, fire engine red and almost glowing where the beam from the uplights caught it, the more she began to obsess. What would Father Michael say when he came back and saw litter clogging the approach to God's house and indeed his own house next door? Wouldn't he think her neglectful, or perhaps incapable? If she couldn't even remove the accumulated litter from the path, then what good was she as a sacristan anyway? Speaking to me later that night, first over the phone and then in person, Claudette said that she couldn't get those packets out of her mind.
It was like they were mocking me, calling to me and telling me I was no good, that I needed to be replaced, or that I wasn't trying hard enough. I had to move them. I didn't want to go outside into the dark. But you know, it had been weeks since I'd seen anything strange and I had my rosaries and things with me. I thought, maybe if I just nipped out quickly, I could take my litter picker and just grab them before Father Michael came back.
She said that she looked over and over at the clock. The priest was due back at 7. By the time the clock said 6:50 p.m, she was already bundling herself out of the door, litter picker in hand, ready to snatch the offending item just in the nick of time. Outside, she said, it was freezing. Whilst much of the snow we'd had over Christmas had melted by then, some small dirty patches remained in places where the sun would rarely strike. It was too cold for it to melt otherwise, especially now at night in the dark. Walking slowly over to the path, to the rose bushes, and to the packets, Claudette listened carefully. Far off, she could just make out the sound of music, playing either from someone's car or a TV in one of the nearby houses. Closer, in the nearby trees, crows were roosting, and their incessant croaking chatter, back and forth exchanges as they settled unseen in the blackness above, was in some ways comforting.
I knew I was not completely alone, but I was nervous even then. I was muttering the rosary the whole time under my breath as I walked, even though I had a clear direction and a target. Grab the packets and go. I couldn't keep my eyes just on them. I kept looking around. Halle Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. I looked up at the building behind me, at the trees and bushes, at how black and dark it looked back there. How very, very dark. Blessed art thou amongst women, and I could still hear the crows above, but I wasn't listening for them. I was listening for growling, for that low, rumbling noise I heard that night, coming out of that thing. Or the sound of something moving in those bushes, the snap of a twig, or the crunch of footsteps. I don't mind telling you I was terrified. Pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Once I grabbed those packets, I turned straight around and started heading back to the sacristy. But I was stopped in my tracks when I heard Father Michael calling to me. At first, I turned expecting to see the father. The way he called was almost normal. Almost, but it wasn't him. It's funny because it was sort of his voice, but it wasn't his way of speaking, if that makes sense. You know how Father Michael talks? He speaks quickly. He always has, like he's trying to put more words into the sentence than he has time to get out. As if he thinks the next time he closes his mouth he won't be able to open it again. So when he just said my name, all long and slow like that, "Claudette! Claudette!" Well, I knew straight away. I knew. You see that it wasn't him. Not only that, but whenever Father Michael comes back from his errands, he comes up the front, from the streets facing the church. He always comes that way, along the path toward the church. That's why I was so worried about those packets, because I knew he'd walk past them, and then if he saw them, what would he think? And, well, when he called to me in that voice that was his but wasn't, well, the voice wasn't coming from the front, it was from somewhere around the side of the church, as if he had come from round the back, through the woods and out of the dark. For a second I thought about running, but you know I'm not good on my pins and it's been slippery. The idea that I might fall and then not be able to get up when whatever was calling to me came around. I moved, as fast as I could, toward the door of the sacristy, sort of shuffling to try and keep myself from falling. I only happened to glance back once and I saw him. Father Michael, coming out of the shadows. But he wasn't walking. He was on all fours, like a dog or something. Not only that, but he was the wrong way up. You know what Father Michael looks like, with all that red hair and the big beard and those glasses. I always told him those glasses didn't suit him, and that they looked like something from the 1970s. But whatever this was, it had the glasses, it had his dog collar, his black shirt and pants. It looked just like him, but wrong. He was belly up, like he was doing a crab walk or something, moving on his hands and feet, but all the angles were wrong. His arms were bending forward at the joint like knees, and his legs went in the wrong direction. But it was his head that showed it. It was on the wrong way. If he was in a crab walk, then his face should have been pointing up toward the sky, but it wasn't. It was turned and angled forward toward me, the skin all warped and stretched in the wrong direction, and in his mouth, when it opened to talk, there were fingers. Little fingers came out of the mouth, pulling the lips aside like there was a little person trying to crawl out through it. There were dozens of them, fingers just swaying and moving and feeling like antennae on an insect of tentacles or something. I screamed and finally managed to get to the door. I flung it back, got inside, and locked it. Then I put a chair up against the door and got on my knees and prayed and prayed. I prayed so hard, holding onto the rosary so hard that they cut my hands. I kept waiting for the door to burst open, for that thing with the fingers spilling and crawling out of its mouth to smash through a window or slither somehow into the house. There was nothing I could do, no way I could fight it, so I just prayed. I was there for nearly an hour in absolute terror, waiting for something to happen, praying to Almighty God that it wouldn't. It was only when I realised that the time had passed and that Father Michael wasn't home yet that I suddenly snapped back to reality. He was late. He was never late. In the entire time I had been working for him, and he'd been living here at the sacristy, he had been on the dot and punctual for everything. From the time he rose and breakfasted to the services. I mean, it was obviously possible that he could have been delayed. Things happen. He was out doing the sacrament of the sick. It wasn't beyond reason that one of the parishioners might have passed away in the meantime. There would be paperwork or condolences. He might have been delayed by the weather, even though he was on foot by traffic or congestion, making it harder to cross the roads. I thought of loads of reasons why he might be late, but in my heart of hearts I knew. I knew that something had got him, and that's why I called you.
The call during which Claudette shared these strange details came around an hour after they occurred. By this time, I was already on my way to the church. I was already rushing there, but was forced to race even faster still by the way in which that call suddenly and abruptly ended. It ended with Claudette screaming. She was repeating over and over that she could hear Father Michael outside. Now, there were two voices, and one of them screeched in terror.
"It's him!"
She cried.
"It's Father Michael, he's come back and that thing has gone for him. I have to go out, I have to help him."
I tried to stop her. I cried over and over, "No!" pleading with her and trying in a torrent of half-mangled explanations that what she was hearing wasn't Father Michael. The thing waiting for her outside was trying to deceive her, to lead her outside so that it could eventually devour her. But she only kept screaming, screaming and screaming until finally the line went dead. I knew that meant that she had gone outside and that by the time I reached the church, she would probably be dead too.